welcome to One Church. My name is Ryan Gear. I'm the lead pastor here, and I know it's awkward to watch a sermon on video, but right now I'm in Nicaragua with our Nicaragua mission team. This is the very first team that we've sent to the village of San Bartolo, Nicaragua, and 50 of you, at least 50 families in our congregation, are sponsoring children in the village of San Bartolo. And so right now, we're hanging out with the kids that you're sponsoring and their families and meeting community leaders and partnering with a group called Food for the Hungry, and in a way that will hopefully be a long-term plan, several-year partnership with the village of San Bartolo. And so thank you for letting me get away to do that. I'll be back next week for the start of our new series, Inked. But today I want to welcome you, especially if you're new with us. I want you to know that you're a guest, and we're glad you're here. And you received a worship folder when you came in. And if you would, please look at the perforated card on that worship folder. If you would, please fill that out and tell us about yourself. And if you tear that card off during the worship service and you take it to the information center in the foyer, someone will greet you, and they have a gift to give you as a small way of saying thank you for worshiping with us today. But I want to welcome you, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. And today we're concluding, actually, our series, My Type. It's based on the Myers-Briggs personality concept. And this week we're talking about artisans. And every week we've been reminded of the same scriptures about the big picture of what it means to follow Jesus. If we were to ask Jesus, what does it mean to follow you? Jesus would say something like this. This comes from the Gospel of Mark. The most important command, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. In other words, with everything you are. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. And we've said every week that loving God with all that we are and loving our neighbors as ourselves is a growth process. Nobody quite has that one figured out quickly. So it's a process of growth that God leads us on to reach this goal of following Jesus. And the Apostle Paul puts it this way in Romans 12, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And we're studying these personality types because, according to the Myers-Briggs concept, all of us are wired differently. We process information differently, we make decisions differently, and that means we grow to be more like Jesus differently. And if we understand how we're wired, our personality makeup, then we're able to grow in a customized way, to know what our natural strengths are, to know what our natural weaknesses are, and grow to love God and our neighbors as ourselves in a way that is customized to who we are. So here are the characteristics of artisans. Artisans are fun-loving. Artisans are usually smiling and having a good time. Artisans are optimistic. They want to make the future better and enjoy life in the future as well as today. Artisans are realistic. Again, being sensors, they're grounded in the here and now. They're open to what's really going on, facts and figures. Artisans are unconventional and bold. They look for new, exciting ways to do something, and they're not afraid to push the envelope and be adventurous and just put themselves out there and see how things turn out. They aspire to be a virtuoso in their field, and they'll be inventive and creative. Artisans are spontaneous. They live in the here and now. Artisans prize freedom. When you're spontaneous and bold, you need freedom. And then as leaders, artisans are troubleshooting leaders. They see, again, real-world details, and they excel at being tactical. When they see problems or something that is chaotic or a mess, artisans can step into that situation with optimism and being able to see the real-world situation and calm everybody down. They can be lighthearted, they can joke, they can have a way with people that inspires people, that helps them to think clearly and see what we really need to do to solve the problems in the organization or the business or the family, and then go forward and create better times. So let's see how artisans experience their relationships, their career, and their spiritual life. In romantic relationships, artisans first and foremost want a playmate, somebody to have fun with and to experience adventure with. We remember from the first parts of the series, rationals want a mind mate. Idealists look for a soulmate. Guardians want to be a helpmate. Artisans look for a playmate. And that doesn't mean that the person who's with an artisan has to be as fun-loving or as open and adventurous as an artisan, but the person at least has to be willing to come along for the ride. And in general, artisan relationships are a balancing act. On one side, artisans want to be with somebody who is open and wants to have fun in life and is at least open to new experiences in life and living life to the fullest. But on the other hand, artisans need someone who can bring enough stability to the relationship that it's not all fun and excitement and adventure all the time. There needs to be sometimes organization and just slowing down and just recharging in life. And so artisans have this balancing act in relationships that they need somebody who's open and fun, but they also need somebody who will bring stability to the relationship. Second, if you're single as an artisan, patience is the key to finding the right person. If you're an artisan who likes to live in the moment, there can be a high price for always living in the moment, in the here and now. And how this looks is that sometimes artisans will find themselves settling down with somebody, not because that person was necessarily the best person for them, but because that person was there. That person was there at the time, and one thing just kind of led to another, and now they're together, and they can experience rocky times in a relationship because that person wasn't necessarily the best match for them. And at the same time, again, artisan relationships are often a tightrope. If you're with somebody if you're an artisan and you're with somebody who you think, yeah, maybe that was the case, maybe they weren't necessarily the best match, but the person was there at the time, now artisans are faced with the choice of walking away and looking for something else, or developing the relationship that they have. And what's the saying? Dance with the one who brung you. That it's, if at all possible, I always encourage couples, if at all possible, it's less painful for everybody involved to try to develop the relationship you have and to do everything you possibly can to make it work. And patience is the key there too. That the person will not always be as fun and open as you are. They won't seek adventure as much as you wish they would. But you can be patient and bring them along and communicate your needs if you're an artisan with the person you're with. And hopefully if that person loves you, that person will be as open as they can to living life as an adventure with you as an artisan. And then finally, communication is the key in every relationship. What's true of artisans sometimes is that artisans are not necessarily the best at handling conflict. Artisans don't like conflict, they like to avoid conflict. Conflict is not fun. It's not something enjoyable. And working through conflict is not necessarily enjoyable. So what will happen sometimes is that artisans, instead of dealing with the conflict, will walk away and look for a better situation. I have a great friend of mine who was married for 12 years, and he got married very young. And he's an artisan, and his wife was not necessarily as open to enjoying life as he was. And after 12 years, that relationship ended, and the truth is he pretty much walked away. Instead of talking in a healthy, constructive way with her and resolving conflict, he let his feelings, his feelings of disappointment and being alone in the relationship fester and grow and grow and grow until over time he just couldn't face them anymore. And he walked away from the relationship. So communication is the key. Specific communication. If you're an artisan, you want to communicate your needs and your hopes and dreams for the relationship with your partner. And again, be patient with that person. Try to bring them along to be more open and to see life as an adventure. If you are with an artisan and you're not sure at times how to be the person, the open and adventurous person the artisan wants you to be, you want to communicate that. as clearly and specifically as possible. Artisans don't read minds. Artisans may not pick up on some deep hidden feelings that you have, and it will be extremely important that you communicate those needs to your artisan partner as clearly and concretely and specifically as possible, and as kindly as possible, but be clear and specific about how you feel in the relationship. And when two people love each other, you can work through all kinds of things, even if you thought you could never make it through it. So it's a little bit, at least, about artisan relationships. You can find a lot more in the websites in your worship folder. Now on to career. You find artisans in careers like sales, entertainment, public relations, self-employed business people. As mediators, artisans are great at diplomacy and negotiation. Law enforcement and education. Of course, there are all kinds of other careers that artisans are in, but those are some common ones. So here's some famous artisans from arts and entertainment. Elvis, Elizabeth Taylor, Picasso, Judy Garland, Spielberg, Mozart, Madonna, Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, Katy Perry. From politics and government, military, FDR, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Winston Churchill, when the UK was being attacked by Hitler in World War II and life was chaos, Winston Churchill was a bold and optimistic leader, and his strength carried the British people through that experience of World War II. In business, in industry, John Paul Getty, Donald Trump, Charles Lindbergh. In the Bible, there are several Bible characters that I think were probably artisans. From the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, I think Rebecca was probably an artisan. If you know the story of Rebecca in Genesis, Rebecca marries Isaac, and they have two sons, Esau and Jacob. And Rebecca is kind, she's outgoing. There's a story about how she first met her husband Isaac. He traveled from another location, and she brought water out to Isaac and his party that he was with, and she went above and beyond, and she watered all of his camels, and that was the sign that she was a great match for Isaac. Like, watering camels was a really attractive thing in the ancient Middle East, and so Rebecca went above and beyond and was an outgoing, bold person. Later in life, we find out that Jacob is her favorite son, and she shrewdly tricks her husband Isaac into blessing Jacob instead of Esau. She's tactical. She knows how to get what she wants. She's a bargainer in relationships. Her son Jacob is probably an artisan as well. And just incidentally, my sister-in-law and brother-in-law just had a little baby a few days ago, and they named him Jacob. Here's a picture of little Jacob. Another artisan in the Bible was King David. King David was the most successful king in Israel's history, and he was a warrior poet. David expanded the borders of Israel by conquering neighboring people groups. And at the same time, he wrote beautiful poetry and music. And David was known as a man after God's own heart. He was not a perfect man. David made mistakes. The most famous one was a mistake when he had an affair with a woman named Bathsheba, and that cost David a very high price in his life. But David was someone who knew about the grace of God as well, and we'll talk about grace a little bit later. One of the most beautiful expressions of having a change of heart and accepting God's grace is found in Psalm 51, the Psalm of David. But David is probably the ultimate artisan in the Bible. Finally, how does being an artisan affect your spiritual life? Like we said last week about guardians, artisans probably grow best in groups. Artisans are so social that they tend to take on the characteristics of the people they're with. They kind of become like their environment to some degree. And so for an artisan to grow spiritually, the best thing they could do is surround themselves with a group of people who want to grow as well. And in one church, the best way to do that is a one group. You can sign up for a new one group. They just started a couple of weeks ago. You can sign up at the information center out in the foyer after the service. One groups are the absolute best way to meet other people, to have a supportive environment, to have encouragement, to surround yourself with the right kind of people who have similar goals, and can help you grow. Another great way that you can grow in groups at one church is to get involved in a ministry. It's to serve in some way. Now, there are all kinds of ways to serve in one church. You can learn about some of those ways at onechurch.com/connect. And we also have an event coming up that is a great opportunity to serve in several ways. It's the Back to School Blessing Shoe Drive. And the city of Chandler is collecting shoes and is going to give shoes to needy students on July 19th at Chandler High School. But we're one of the groups that is collecting shoes to give to that event. Next week, June 29th, is the last Sunday that you can donate shoes. And you can purchase a new pair of athletic shoes for a child in any size that would fit a child from kindergarten to 12th grade. And you can bring those in, just drop them off at the Information Center next Sunday, and we'll make sure that those shoes get to Chandler High School. You can also serve at that event on July 19th, and we'll be sharing details about that in the next week or so. But artisans probably grow best in groups. The second way that an artisan can grow spiritually, and this really has to do with serving as well, but this is a way of serving that is probably specific to artisans. Artisans have the opportunity to use your personality to boldly promote Jesus to the people around you. Artisans, by their very nature, attract attention. Artisans are influential. Even if you're not, a kind of flashy, extroverted person, even artisans who are more introverted still influence people. They just have bold, creative ideas, and they're usually still good at relating with other people. And so artisans are very influential. And the question is, how will you use your influence? If you're an artisan and you want to grow closer to Christ, and to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself, how will you influence? How will you use your gifts to influence the people around you? And however that is, that affects you too. However you influence other people around you, it also affects your own spiritual life. And so, how could you be a positive, Jesus-oriented influence on the people around you? All right, now I want to park for a few minutes on amazing grace. God's amazing grace. If you remember back to week 1, we said that the church has often called rationals too skeptical. Well, if the church has called rationals too skeptical, the church has traditionally called artisans too worldly. Again, artisans are people who live in the here and now. They live in the moment, in the real world of concrete experiences and the 5 senses, and they're open to new experiences, always seeking new adventures in life. And people like that often have an interesting relationship with the church. Throughout church history, the church has looked down on the material world, the physical world, and at times the arts and fashion and the finer things in life, experiences that artisans often seek. And it's ironic that the church would look down on those physical experiences involving the 5 senses, because the sacraments, the means of grace, baptism and communion, the most important aspects of worship in the history of Christianity, involve the 5 senses. They involve physical elements: baptism, water, communion, bread, and wine. Next week I'm starting a new series called Inked, Baptism and Communion. And we're going to look at the meaning behind baptism and communion, experience the power of those things that involve the 5 senses and physical elements. Quickly, I want to show you a promo for the series that's going to start next Sunday, Inked, Baptism and Communion. Inked, Baptism and Communion starts next week. Now, not only have artisans had a sometimes difficult relationship with church because of the church's view of the material world and the 5 senses and the physical world, but because of their wiring, artisans have at times crossed boundaries that the church has a very difficult time dealing with. And often when that happens, the church has reacted in ways that were judgmental. And they condemned artisans for crossing those boundaries that the church has a difficult time with. There was a young woman who got pregnant at an early age, and she was not married when she got pregnant. And churches always deal with out-of-wedlock pregnancy well. And this situation was no different. She was raised in that church. The people of the church knew her. But when she got pregnant at a young age, she felt the way that people in the church looked at her change. She felt the judgment. As her belly grew, she felt the disapproving glances of people in the congregation. It was a very difficult time for her that really affected her view of the church and her relationship with church people for years to come after that. But she decided to have the baby, and she gave birth to a little boy. And when she could have distanced herself from the church because of the judgment, because of their reaction to her circumstance, she stayed. And she chose to take this little boy to Sunday school classes and let him be a part of the life of the church. And he could learn about Jesus and learn how to grow up to be a good person. And she did that even with the judgment that she felt still at times from people in the church. She could have walked away, but she didn't. That person was my mom. My mom is probably right on the line between being a guardian and an artisan. And I'm thankful for the choices that my mom made. Even though she felt the judgment of far too many church people because of her pregnancy at an early age, she looked beyond just church people, and she looked to a God who offers amazing grace. There's a reason that Amazing Grace is the most popular song in the Christian world. Because when you really have an experience, when you really feel the grace of God, the mercy of God, the forgiveness of God. Grace means unmerited favor. It means God's favor toward you, and that God likes you even if you don't deserve it. When you really experience the grace of God, it can be jaw-dropping. When you feel God's unconditional love for you. And my mom was able to look past the judgment that she felt from too many church people, and she looked to God's amazing grace and God's acceptance of her. And so as an artisan, this may or may not apply to you, but if it does, you may have experienced the judgment of church people. Artisans often have to roll their eyes at the behavior they see in churches. So many Christians talk about love, and then as soon as somebody crosses a line somewhere, they just pile on and shoot their wounded. All of us, whether we're artisans or not, need God's amazing grace. And if you feel the need for God's grace in your life, if you know that maybe you've crossed some boundaries that have been harmful in your life, and you want God's forgiveness for those things, and you want a new start, and you want to accept God's grace, in a moment I want to lead in a prayer. And of course, everybody needs this, whether we're artisans or not. But I want to lead in a prayer of acceptance, because grace is a gift. If someone offers you a gift, you just reach out to accept it and say thanks. And God's grace is a gift to you and I that He is offering to each one of us right now. If you feel the need to accept God's gift of grace in your life, His forgiveness, His mercy, a new start, today would be a perfect day to do that. At the end of this My Type series, we've talked about the goal of loving God as with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbors as ourselves. And unfortunately, we're aware that we often fall short of that goal of following Jesus. And this would be a perfect day for us to be reminded all over again of God's gifts of grace, or maybe even to accept it for the first time. If you've never accepted God's gift of grace, amazing grace, you can reach out and take that gift. And here's what God's amazing grace means. God's grace means that God can take a broken heart and scars and pain from the past, and God can create a heart of joy and gladness and thankfulness and hope for the future. God can create a beautiful thing out of a mess. It's what God does. It's God's specialty. God can take something that you thought there was no hope, and God can bring something totally new and hope-filled out of that. When you think it's the end, because of God's grace, it can just be a new beginning. And so if you would like to accept that gift of God's grace, I invite you to pray with me right now. God, thank you for how you have created each one of us individually. As the scripture says, we're fearfully and wonderfully made. And we're all wired in different ways. We all have unique personalities. And if these personality types can help us to understand a little bit about how we're wired and help us to grow, to be more like Jesus, to love you with all we are, and to love our neighbors as ourselves in a customized way, then great. And God, when we look at what it means to follow Jesus, we're reminded, God, of how we need your grace. Because we fall short. God, there were times, even this week, when I didn't love you with all that I am, and I didn't love my neighbors as myself. God, I ask your forgiveness for those things. For those of us, God, who have felt looked down on by the church, judged, not accepted. God, help us to not just know in our heads, but to feel right now, to feel that you are not always represented by people who claim to represent you. That you are not, quote unquote, church people. God, I would much rather fall into your hands than into the hands of people. You are much more gracious and merciful than human beings. And God, may we look past those who have hurt us or who have disappointed us or who have judged us. And may we look to you, a God of amazing grace. God, through your Son Jesus, his death on the cross, his resurrection, his life that shows us how to live, God, you offer us grace. The gift of your love, whether we deserve it or not, your unconditional love and acceptance. And God, right now, where we sit, we want to reach out and accept that gift of your grace. And God, when we are tempted to feel guilty, when we're tempted to feel outcast or judged, God, may we instead feel gratitude to you. Because you have given us your gift of grace, your love no matter what. And that motivates us, God, to want to follow you more, to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, and to love you with all we are, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. God, we accept your free gift of grace, your amazing grace. In Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. Now, as we sing this final song together, may we be reminded of God's amazing grace toward us.